Welcome back. My name is Aveek Sen, and I'm going to keep my remarks absolutely to a minimum, apart from the sort of the moderation rules which I feel that I ought to declare before the session begins. We are going to go in the order in which the names appear in the book. And I'm afraid we have to be very, very strict with the time that is allotted to each of us. And we have a kind of remote timekeeper in the person of Selina, who's going to hold up a 3-minute thing when there are 3 minutes left, and then stop or something like that at the end of the 15 minutes. And so we do have to be quite careful about, how long we speak. I thought it would be good to have three presentations, one after another, and then open the presentations to a kind of discussion within the panel, also moving out into the audience, then have a break, and then do the remaining 3, and then have a larger discussion and Q&A session with the audience at the very end. So even if you don't get the chance to speak initially, try to keep your question in mind so that you can put it at the end to whoever you want to ask it. So we are moving from valuation to inhabitation, and by now it's quite clear that the state of nature is inseparable from the nature of the state. So these are 2 themes that will emerge even when we are talking about representation and language and myth and narrative in relation to nature. And I think with that, we will just get into Ranjit Hoskote, his presentation, art critic, poet, translator. And I'm not going to get into elaborate introductions as well. Ranjit, over to you.
Thanks so much, Aveek. Is this working? Aveek, thank you so much for your introduction. I'd also like to thank Ravi Agarwal, of course, friend and comrade from many different barricades, and Martin and Bernd and Akil for this constellation of perspectives. And we've had an absolutely rich and engaging morning, and I see a gear shift to a more, if you will, artistic panel. And one of the occupational hazards of having a hybrid practice as I do is that I've often been a poet among the theorists, a theorist among the curators, and so on and so forth. So I just want to make it quite explicit that I'm speaking here really as a poet, as someone who's been preoccupied through various processes of research with questions of language, and with the question of what it means in many ways to be an interlingual subjectivity. So what I have to say today emerges from that. It's going to be in the nature of, I'm looking at the watch quite intently, it's going to be in the nature of a shuffle, a collage, if you will. And I'll begin quite directly by saying that one of the entry points into these urgencies for me came about in early March 2013 when we were in Utrecht and heard Professor Bilgrami's compelling critique of the Lockean contractarian paradigm, which he then put out in very, very crisp terms. So I'm going to begin by simply putting down these questions that he posed to the Lockean paradigm as a starting point, and I quote him. How and when did we transform the concept of human beings into citizens? How and when did we transform people into populations? How and when did we transform a knowledge to live by into a concept of expertise? How and when did we transform the concept of nature into the concept of resources? End of quote. And I'd like to place in relation to these key questions that Professor Bilgrami put in place a simple, precise, and lethal pronouncement by an intellectual idol of my teenage years, the anthropologist and pioneer of cybernetics, Gregory Bateson. And Bateson says this in 1970, "The creature that wins against its environment destroys itself." So I'd like to preface what I'm saying with these two. Not only does the creature that wins against its environment destroy itself, but I think the wrong word, the wrong choice of words, the wrong discourse can equally produce a deep alienation and eventually can be highly destructive. So this is what I want to dwell on in the next move that I make. In the shadow of Professor Bilgrami's questions, my concern here is with how language shapes a world, how specific languages carry their own aura of associations, how words that seem to mean the same thing mean, in fact, quite different and sometimes opposite things, depending on the conceptual armatures from which they emerge and how they resist mutual translation. I'm preoccupied shortly with the question of how some modes of language function as a distortion field for power, and also conversely, how other modes of language might serve as a seedbed for the possibilities of what I'm going to call here generosity, which for me has meanings also of communion, of solidarity, of the formation of a community, if you will. And as I go along, I'm just thinking that if you say forest, Wald, Aranya, Vana, the associations that come with these are radically and sometimes I think untranslatably different. And specifically I'm concerned here, as I said, with two modes of language. On the one hand, and we heard a great deal of very detailed and meticulous evidence of this in the morning sessions, I think most of us today are trapped in a crisis that comes of being not only between two material conditions, but also two languages. Over on the one hand is the abstract language of policy, which is top-down, which is context-free, and indeed context-averse, which is structured, I will argue, on a very hard syntax, the kind of syntax that is premised on closure and totality, and which is premised also on the reductive accounting of experience. The language of policy tries to reduce experience to a certain kind of closed, literally totalitarian syntax. On the other hand, I've been more and more concerned as I read Braj Bhasha, work with Urdu, and as I've worked for many years with Kashmiri, I'm preoccupied with languages that breathe a possibility of redemption, languages that engage with, which disclose, and which suture the kind of violence that emanates from the language of power. So these languages of generosity, I would suggest, are bottom-up. They're embedded in particularity of context. They're sensitive to local usage, to social and cultural practice, and are structured along what I'm thinking of as a parataxis. So if the language of policy is syntactic, closed, totalitarian, these languages of generosity, and I'll speak to this with some examples. The languages of generosity believe in juxtapositions which throw up their own illumination, so they're far more paratactic, and they resist translation. I'm saying this as a translator. It's a sort of counterintuitive sort of thing to say. But I think that many of these languages, in their nuance and what they encrypt, resist easy translation. And I'm coming now to the core of this presentation. What I find particularly urgent and even tragic today is the fact that as languages of generosity die out, we are losing ecologies as well as languages. We are losing these languages of generosity to the inexorable expansion of an urban-centric industrial and post-industrial model of economic advancement. And even as we lose these, we are being over-inscribed, overwritten, dictated to by the language of policy. And for me, a recent and dramatic example of this was the draft National Forest Policy, which was shared some months ago online. This document speaks the language of power. Its discourse is what I would call, in this context, a proprietarian discourse that's aligned with the paradigm of ownership. As someone who works with language and the play of language as a medium, I find myself shocked when I read this kind of document. It's premised on a colonial-style understanding of forests as effectively plantations. There are many, many people in this room who have devoted their lives to these questions, so this does not come as news to you. But when we see it as, say, as poets or as artists from the outside, what is immediately clear here is that this way of constructing a situation and a nation state and the relationships between communities and so-called resources stems from the revenue parameters of an extractive state. And it has, as you all know, very real consequences. It makes, because it's premised on this plantation, extractive, exploitative model, it makes no provisions for zones or microenvironments that do not conform to the plantationist typology. So a variety of landscapes, habitats, ecologies, whether grasslands or swamps, will simply have no protection. In the obsession with a narrow definition of forest, based on an instrumentalization of natural resources, we are very likely to lose deserts, grasslands, marshes, and other technically non-forest areas, which in turn, as you all know, renders vulnerable the animal and bird species dependent on these non-forest zones, and in turn also raises questions of human livelihood, livelihoods that are intimately linked to these now presumably unprotected zones. We see here also the influential phantom of a way of thinking about the wilderness, the feral. Things that come to us from very, very strange optics. They emerge from the optic of the Enlightenment. They also emerge from a certain language of romanticism, where the forest is the other, it's the site of the other, it's a place to be looked upon with suspicion and fear. Sometimes as the site of the sublime, but also as a place of fear and anxiety. And again, using a term that was dear to Gregory Bateson, I'm suggesting that the language of policy is marked by the strategic imperative of schismogenesis. Policy creates schisms and delights in schisms and preserves a schismatic structure in some way. And I'm going to skip where I had a brief meditation on Wittgenstein's notion of a private language, and is the state as a singular entity really speaking a private language which only the state and its apparatus really understands. But I'm going to bracket that, and I'm going to jump directly to what I regard as resources of hope, forms of what I think of as anamnesia as we counter these perils that are material, structural, as well as linguistic, because they have consequences also for how we mold our own consciousness or how our consciousness is molded. So I'm going to dwell on 5 of these fragments or traces or figments, which I see as resources of hope. And I say this in complete awareness that faced with the scale of the urgency, the kinds of challenges that we face and which were marvelously delineated by the previous panel, this might seem to be in the nature of a literary conceit or something that is held in reserve. But I'd like to put it out for what it's worth, because it seems to me that it is worthwhile to return to paradigms that have been rendered obsolescent, that have been stigmatized, and to see if there is yet something there that can provide us some hope for our present struggles. And there are 6 of these which I will address very briefly. The first I will address truly briefly because I know Ravi is going to talk about it. I'm thinking of the expressive languages of Sangam poetics, because it allows us to think about how one can imagine a relationship to nature, to landscape, which is based on a certain sort of equity. There is an emotional, affective investment in each one of these 5 landscapes that are spelt out in classical Tamil poetry. Kurinchi, which is the mountains, Mulai, the forests, Marutam, the cropland, Netal, which is the seashore, and Pale, which is the desert. Each landscape, as those of you who have read these things, probably through A.K. Ramanujan, which is my route to it, would know that each of these landscapes comes, as it were, already associated with factors of soil, water bodies, the kind of occupations that might be developed there, effectively, and of course the presiding deity. So effectively what you have there is an anthology of locales that bridge psychic interiority with an external reality, and might suggest ways of bridging how we use nature and how we surrender to a larger scheme that is natural, so to speak. The second resource of hope that I have comes from thinking through questions of how forms of landscape are, I mean, one could meditate on forms of landscape, but that is meaningless unless you think through questions of the denizens of those landscapes, the communities that have an intimate connection with these landscapes. And I'm going to simply quote something that I've been reading in recent times. The activist and researcher Narendra, a memoir of his called Bastar Dispatches. And it's based on 3 decades of work in a village in Bastar called Abujmad. And he writes, and I quote, 3 acres of traditional space, Hoskote, have traditionally involved land, water bodies, or forests which were not owned by any agency. It was symbolic of well-being and the values of people, their self-esteem and cultural confidence. Bastar is now rapidly losing out to alien and powerful modern agencies with no local lineage, end of quote. 2 quick points here. One is that Mukul in a very salutary manner offered us a caveat about not romanticizing under the primitivist fallacy these notions of the sacred grove, zones that seem to be unowned. But I would simply like to think of this as some kind of metaphor that might yet be compelling for us for political practice going forward. The idea of a resource that is not a resource, that is not instrumentalized, that is held in common, and with a notion of intergenerational trusteeship. I dwell on this word Hoskote, of the Purk, of the ancestors. It's an intriguing word, and I think that there is a sense of continuity that's involved there, which invites us to not over-extract and not over-exploit this thing that is held in trust. And it also occurs to me that as we derogate these traditional idioms of self-restraint constantly as symptoms of scarcity, but the derogation of things as symptomatic of scarcity actually stems from a mythology of progress and abundance into which we've talked ourselves, and which is essentially exploitative and extractive. I'm also going to, my third resource of hope, vanishing vocabularies, a poetics of everyday being. I have a certain fondness for micro-projects, the people who go out and collect languages and words that are dying. I think here of Susan Hiller's absolutely marvelous work, The Last Silent Movie, which is a meditation on extinct and endangered languages. Closer home, I'm thinking of the meteorological and landscape glossaries of the Peeply Project. And one of the researchers involved in that project, Arti Kumar Rao, talks about how when she explores the Thar, she meets this person who guides her through the Thar, Chatar Singh, and he says, when he talks of the language, he uses the particular language, which is a kind of language of generosity. He says, "Ye drishya ka roop hai, bhasha nahi." This is a manifestation, if you will, a manifestation of vision. It's an epiphany, not language. And I dwell on words that Chatar Singh passes on. He looks at cirrocumulus clouds, as we would call them, and he refers to them as titar pankhi, partridge-winged. He looks at clouds that resemble women carrying water pots on their heads, and his name for these clouds, unscientific but amazingly real in context, is Panihari. Vitally, I would suggest that these are not mere figures of speech or elements of imagery. Rather, I think they are ways of releasing the individual subjectivity towards a wider sense of the cosmos. They are forms of legibility and intelligibility that are forms of empathy. And I think that what they do, the function, if you will, the psychic, the social function, is to translate the expansiveness and enigma of the cosmic into an idiom that is tender and intimate and even domestic. And I mean domestic quite literally, from the Latin domus, meaning home, to how does one render this cosmic, potentially threatening, vast expanse, how does that become intimate and tender? Do I have 1 minute or half a minute? What do I have? All right, okay. I'll skip one of those resources of hope, and I'm going to cut right to...
This would be as per Indian standard, 15 minutes to 16.
Okay, I'm simply going to close because I began by talking about the language of policy and the languages of generosity. I'm going to end by bearing witness. Essentially, I've borne witness to various of these moments and occasions. I'm going to end with an instance of language making as resistance. And this is taken from Nancy Arjania's book on Navjot, in fact, it was right here, so it's kind of all in the room. The 13th place, Positionality is Critique in the Art of Navjot Altaf. And this has to do not with Navjot, but with one of Navjot's collaborators. As many of you know, and she'll talk about it, she's been in a long-term dialogue and collaboration and effectively living with artists from Bastar, from Kondagaon, around the dialogue center. And one of these artists is an artist called Rajkumar. And at some point in 2007, Nancy Adejania, who was there to research the book, had a conversation with Rajkumar. She's had an independent conversation with Rajkumar and Shantibai meanwhile, to ask him about his linguistic experience as someone from Bastar, from a certain kind of rural background. How did he shape the language that accounted for his experience in this collaborative situation? So I'm going to really summarize this. It turns out that Rajkumar embarked on a whole sequence of questioning, verification, and working towards a certain kind of language. So when Nancy asked him whether customized terms such as collaboration and cooperation were organic to what he was doing, he went on to say that he began by using the Sanskritized Hindi term Kala Sahyog. Upon being pressed further by Nancy Adejania and asked whether this term was less alienating than the English term collaboration, he then went on to say that he used another approximation, a dialect word, Bertia, which was embedded in the local cultural and economic context, the word that they use when they help neighbors to mark a boundary in the fields, build a house, or fix a roof, and then there's a barter exchange which seals this contract, if you will. Finally, Rajkumar said that none of these words worked for him, and that he ditched them all to move towards a word of his own invention, which was Akal Bata Bati. And this is a word he invented. And to me, this marks, if you will, it's a moment, it's a micro-political moment. But I cherish that as a moment of agency, of reclaiming agency, because this is a word he invents. Akal, of course, comes from an Arabic root, akal, the intellect, illumination. Bata Bati is a notion of sharing. And this is a term that he invents. And it speaks to his sense of his sociality, his labor, and his sharing. And I'll close with that as an example of what I have in mind when I speak of reclaiming languages of generosity, working to an ethic of dwelling together in collaboration. Thanks for your patience and your attention.
I think we'll move directly on to Sheba Chhachhi, artist, feminist activist, thinker, writer, teacher.
Is this working? After that long list of descriptions, I want to simply say that I speak here today as an inhabitant of the city of Delhi. One of the things that I felt was appearing as a kind of uninflected trope of nature was the idea of the forest, the rural nature away from the city, especially through the morning session. I would propose that the city itself produces a state of nature, that it is in fact very much part of what we mean when we describe nature or the interconnected web of being within which human beings, rivers, cities, multi-species of all kinds ranging from cockroaches to elephants inhabit. I've been troubled for a very long time by the implacable indifference of the city of Delhi, its governance, and its citizens, its inhabitants, to the willful, systematic, and orchestrated destruction of its choked and stinking river, the Yamuna. This is almost beyond belief. The river moves forgotten between bridges reverberating with the haste of daily aspiration, remembered only for the enactment of a half-remembered ritual that needs waters to be completed. However, in the mythic imaginary of religious, communitarian, and popular culture, the goddess Yamuna, the embodied form of the river, is not only alive, but resplendent. I quote, this is from a 14th century hymn of praise to the Yamuna, which is still sung every morning on the banks as a daily offering to the goddess Yamuna. O daughter of the sun, Yamuna Devi ji, your waters, fragrant with forest blossoms, you cascade down from Mount Kalinda, crystal white, your flow luxurious. Parrots, peacocks, swans as loving friends, your waves are like bangles, the sand like gems. Your banks curve beautiful hips. One who sips your waters fears not Yama, the god of death, for you are his beloved sister. Your water is the love juice of the gods. In them one experiences divine erotic bliss. O daughter of the sun, Yamuna Devi ji. The mythology of the Yamuna, the stories, present her as a sexual, sensuous woman, as this description abundantly presents. She is, tales are told of her incestuous desire for her brother, Yama, the upholder of Dharma. She is the lover of Krishna. She is dark, unlike the fair, white Ganga, sexual, active, embodied. So in this worship that the devotee offers to this figure, the goddess Yamuna, what happens to these stories? What happens to the ritual practices? What happens to these texts, which reveal, in fact, a richly embedded eco-philosophy? I mean, this could also be a kind of description of a biosphere, that text, which articulates an ideal mode of being in relation to the river and to nature in general. It is about really a way of being, a way of inhabiting. Why does this not translate into eco-conscious behavior? Why does the devotee seem absolutely indifferent to the fact that the river is dying? Why is it that the devotee, after making the offering, receiving the prasad, will wrap up whatever remnants of waste are produced and throw them into the stinking nala that is now the river? Why is there a disconnect between the ecological wisdom embedded in our cultural practices and current environmental conditions? Is it possible to simultaneously worship and destroy? I'd like to look at three aspects of this, because this whole idea of the divinizing of nature, which we can trace its roots back. I mean, I'm talking about mainstream Hindu culture, but we can trace a lot of this back, the deification of natural forces, to Adivasi pre-modern Hinduism, which is a different kind of construct from the kind of Hinduism we have today, etc., etc. So why is this deification, the making sacred and the worship of a particular natural force, why does this not produce ecologically sensitive behavior? Why does it not produce a caring, nurturing, material acts of conservation towards the river herself? Three things I think are worthy of discussion in this fact. One is the feminine theology of rivers. All rivers in India are goddesses, as are forest groves, as are a number of other forces of nature. What happens is, in fact, that the feminine theology of water and nature works paradoxically. In itself, the act of sacralizing nature can both generate the desire to protect and nurture, as well as obscure the need to protect. The divinity is beyond the potential pollution, corruption, contamination. There is a transcendent divinity who is not subject to the forces of everyday life. Further, the sacralization of the mother, the conceptualization of nature as a maternal feminine, actually is based on the idea of the mother. There have been some references to Mother Earth this morning. Mothers, as we know, idealized within our culture, are venerated for a manner of being that is based on characteristics of negation and sacrifice. This honor accorded to the mother is actually based on her ability to take on anything, to endure everything, and to be willing to give sustenance no matter what is done to her. This is a far cry from the reciprocity which characterized rituals and early exchanges within some of the kind of indigenous knowledge systems that we spoke of earlier. This is actually shifting away from that reciprocity to becoming either child of this all-encompassing mother or lover of this meta-figure. What is happening here, in fact, is a peculiar virtualization of the river, of the goddess. Her body, her actual body, which is the river, and has been through centuries, ends up dematerialized and displaced by the idealized, divinized, deified figure. This virtualization or idealization, to my mind, bears a curious parallel to the displacement of material contact with nature, with trees, with animals, jungles, seas, etc., through high-res media representations, which are the way in which most of us today, whether urban or rural inhabitants, actually engage with nature. This virtualization, and I would link this to some of what Bernd was saying, even the fact that you look at the city through your GPS, is a very different way of walking through the city, a very different way of even driving through the city, to actually understanding the city through this abstracted, in a way, idealized image of the city. So with the loss of the body of the river, and in a sense, a disembodiment of, which underwrites this kind of changing relationship or way of being with nature, produces a peculiar kind of separation, a separation which then absolves the particular inhabitant of any responsibility. Another aspect which ties up with this idea of responsibility, underlying this paradoxical indifference in worship, is a loss of the sense of future. A short-term view seems to dominate all choices, whether of the individual, the devotee, the real estate profiteer, the urban planner, or the state. Okay, I'm going to go into a story which I had sworn I wouldn't do. But in the story of Yayati, the aging king is so driven by the thirst for sensual pleasure that he takes as his own the youth of his son, adding years and vigor to his decrepit body. In the myth, Yayati eventually realizes that desire is insatiable and even 1,000 more years would not enable satisfaction. We seem to have become like Yayati in the first part of the tale, unwilling to look beyond the gratification of the moment. The present itself is evacuated of its presentness. Within an increasingly consumption-driven existence, the market creates a condition of endless anticipation, of deferral, to where what is to be gained empties out what is. We do not seem to fully inhabit the present either. It's a peculiar temporal limbo, where the past is ersatz, present curiously inaccessible, and the future imagined through market-created illusions of acquiring advertised promises. I think we're looking at several ruptures here. The rupture between the embodied powerful goddess with agency to a domesticated one. There's also one I'm not going into that because time does not allow, but you can actually trace the process of the goddess, the independent female goddess, being domesticated and spousified. So earlier, quite aboriginal figures end up as wives of male gods, etc. This also accompanies shifts in means of production and modes of cultivation, etc. There is a rupture between the material body and the deified, idealized, divinized body, and there's an epistemological rupture where practices which developed out of particular knowledge systems are reduced to mechanical ritual and commodified religiosity. Because all the stories are still told, the practices are still enacted, and they become for me a little bit like the plastic Nimbu Mirch that people now hang in their doorway. The original actually had a precise therapeutic, medicinal effect. And there are many other practices that one can think of, which now have been reduced to a sign of themselves. They were always symbolic acts, but a symbolic act that had a kind of embeddedness in materiality. How does one then actually bring the body of the goddess and the idealized goddess together? How does one actually literally member her? And this is obviously a metaphor for all of nature. Can one recuperate from knowledge systems which have these nuggets, these embedded kernels of ecological wisdom, of eco-philosophy? Can one recuperate that into an imaginary which would produce different behavior, which would speak to existing layers of myth, narrative, and ways of being that have gone dormant or have gotten occluded by the forms of practice that today seems to produce? This can be dangerous. Recuperating myth in this period can lead you in the direction of nostalgia, romanticizing. And on the other hand, you can find yourself with very strange company, because we find the fundamentalist Hindu right wing is doing precisely this, recuperating, reworking, and reconstituting both myths and goddesses in particular forms which suit their particular agenda. So is this actually at all a direction that one could consider? Is it, for me, this is a particularly vexed question, because I believed for a long period, and this is very much the work I did, that making alive, in re-energizing these fables and stories, all of which carried a kind of, an example of living the unalienated life, to use the phrase that has come in since Aki's brilliant presentation yesterday. I really believed that representing this could actually alter the kinds of relationships that ordinary people had, particularly with the river. I mean, all this is focused around the river, standing in for other things. So if recuperating the goddess is riven with dangers, would a kind of humanizing, there's some writers who actually argue that we should do away with, because deification, sacredness, does not seem to actually produce material acts of conservation or an enlightened way of being. So do we set that aside and then go for what some people have suggested, the personification, so that Uttarakhand High Court judgment, Bolivia, New Zealand, where forces of nature, rivers, etc., are given the status, living legal entity status, and there's one writer who even suggests, I was very struck by this, that the earth should be described as an aging parent, and that this would produce attitudes of compassion and care. Unfortunately, if you look at what's happening to aging parents in India today, it truly begs the question. So these are a series of questions. Can we actually recuperate certain things in an intelligent manner from the pre-modern? Can we find methods to develop an alternative ecological imaginary? We have a kind of contaminated, still rich, still extant, still popular imaginary. And we have its potential misuse and its potential recuperation in ways that could possibly, I'm really not absolutely sure of this, but could possibly produce a new kind of imaginary where the ideal and the material are co-agents in the continuing process of creation. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheba.